Well, Regina, it's great to be with you. I wish it was in person, and I trust sometime soon it will be that as well. I'm delighted to be part of this conference and to begin the discussion, the presentation here this morning, your time, very early this morning, my time. I was in Vienna in the late 1980s. In my AJC role at the time, we had plans to organize a regional conference that was going to address anti-Semitism in Central Europe. For various reasons, the conference did not come to fruition, but at the time I was there with my colleague, AJC's research director, and we were engaged in plans to commission and conduct an attitude survey in Austria. It was a survey similar to ones we had been conducting in other neighboring countries to gauge popular views and attitudes about Jews. And we were meeting then with the director of the Gallup Institute in Austria to review the questions that would be part of this survey. In the course of that, my colleague asked this director if there had been previous surveys, because often when such surveys are conducted, it can be helpful to ask similar questions or the same questions over time to gauge whether attitudes have changed. And so there were a series of questions that had been part of some earlier surveys that were shared with us. And one of those questions at the time, and it wasn't really a question. I think, as you know, many of these surveys are done in such a way that here is a statement given to the respondent. He or she is asked, do you agree with this or do you disagree with this? So in this case, one of those statements was, I feel revulsion when I shake the hand of a Jew. My colleague, our research director, looked at him and said, really? How can you even ask such a question? In the United States, he said, if a polling firm asked a question like that, more likely than not, the person answering would simply dismiss him out of hand, send him out of the house. The Gallup director looked at him and said, here in Austria, we can ask that question. And in fact, we did. And I think in the end, something like 12% of the respondents answered yes to that statement. I think, as many of you know, there are so few Jews in Austria that it probably was hard to imagine that many of those people had in fact ever shaken or met a Jew in their day-to-day life. Though those surveys gave us a certain picture. I think in the case of Austria, there was a rather high level of anti-Jewish sentiments, feelings expressed in that survey, perhaps upwards of 40%. It was not necessarily something that correlated with anti-Semitic incidents, which were relatively few, but it offered a picture, and it was a disturbing and troubling picture of Austria in the late 1980s. After all, it had elected a president in Kurt Waldheim who had lied about his own Nazi past. Austria at the time had still considered itself Hitler's first victim. It would only be in 1995 that it first addressed the responsibility of acknowledging its role in the Holocaust and of addressing the suffering of Austrian Holocaust victims and the creation of that national fund. There were efforts made to try to bring forward the history of Jewish life in Austria. This goes back also to the time when the city of Vienna reestablished the Jewish Museum, providing that lovely building in the center of Vienna that would serve as the museum. But even that had a somewhat difficult start. And I also recall at the time that first director, Julius Schüps, in one of my visits to Vienna, taking me to the basement storeroom to show me one of the gifts, I guess you could say, he received as part of the museum's collection. This itself was a collection of what was termed anti-Semitica, a vast array of mostly folk art items from different parts of Austria that illustrated, whether they were in ceramic plates or carvings or pictures, really pretty awful anti-Semitic pictures and stereotypes and themes. He said to me, I really don't know what to do with this. What should we do? How can we present it? And in fact, it sat there for a couple of years until they mounted a limited exhibition, but an exhibition that they decided to take place in the, as I recall, the main rooms of the Rathaus in Vienna. And many of these items, others that they brought for this exhibit, were displayed all essentially around the portrait of Karl Lueger. So to really give this sense that anti-Semitism had very much been rooted in that history of Austria. In fact, some of these items, if you visit the museum today, you can see, I believe, in one of the upper floors, and the current museum director, Danielle Spera, also had the challenge of how do you display this? I think in the end, she did it in a very clever way. The items are facing not to the viewer, but backward to a mirror. So when you come to look at it, you see these items, but you see yourself reflected in that mirror as well. I think many of the issues that we were addressing when we spoke about anti-Semitism, we spoke about the need to confront Holocaust history, were very much central to what was taking place during these years in Austria, and many of the developments themselves were troubling. The rise of the Freedom Party of Jörg Haider. We frequently use the term neo-Nazi to refer to movements on the right, various political parties and others. But here, of course, was a neo-Nazi party that had a leader who was voicing clear words of praise for what the Nazis themselves, for what Hitler himself had actually undertaken. In any case, I'm here to speak more broadly and generally about this problem and to focus it more in this 21st century. But I think in raising this, one ought to take note of really how striking, how powerful it was that only in these last days, when we saw the war taking place in Israel, missiles in the thousands launched from Gaza to Israeli cities and towns. Israel under attack, not only physically, but internationally, under heavy criticism for what it was doing. The very fact that the Chancellery of Austria raised the Israeli flag alongside the Austrian flag sent a remarkable message, certainly to the government, to the people of Israel, but I want to say to Jews as well around the world. And it really suggests how far things have come, how far we've traveled since those days of which I speak back 30 years ago. What we have today, I think, in examining the problem of anti-Semitism and enumerating the various ways that we found to address it, to combat it, I want to say very real success and progress in dealing with that problem, even though it is a persistent one, and it is not in many ways diminished in any way as we had hoped. But I think we look back in this case, really about 20 years ago. In 2001, in fact, we will mark this anniversary come August, there was the UN Conference on Racism that took place in Durban, South Africa. This was, of course, intended to be a world conference to focus attention on the problem of racism. But as many of you may know, much in that conference, and particularly in the civil society conference that paralleled the official governmental conference, much of that focused on attacks against Israel and even in a way on attacks on Jewish participants that were in attendance. This was a full focused revival of the Zionism is racism canard. And instead of understanding and seeing anti-Semitism as an essential element of the problem of racism around the world, it almost became a forum to promote anti-Semitism around the world. Now, there had been in various parts of the world preparatory conferences organized that were intended to feed into this Durban conference. And such a conference, bringing together European organizations and communities, and also those from North America, that conference took place in the preceding October in Strasbourg at the Council of Europe. I was among those in attendance. And I think at the time, we had really imagined that anti-Semitism, at least in Europe, was receding into history, was a problem largely historical rather than present day. There were issues that we felt that would be important to be addressed as part of that Durban process. Certainly there was anti-Semitic attacks, voices coming from the extreme right, but societies in general were united in opposing them. There were concerns about Holocaust denial, and some of it was quite bold, bald, straightforward Holocaust denial. But most Jews in Europe were optimistic. Europe had really united. You had seen, we saw the revival of Jewish life in many of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe where it had been decimated during the Holocaust. It had suffered as well under communism, and few people imagined that there would be anything like the revival of Jewish life that took place. And yet between that October of 2000 and August of 2001, things changed dramatically. That peace process that was so promising in the Middle East came to a halt. We eventually saw a second intifada taking place in the Middle East. And paralleling that, we saw a surge of anti-Semitic attacks, of anti-Semitic incidents, particularly in Western Europe. At the time, many political leaders in Europe simply did not see them or see them as being anti-Semitic. In fact, there was a kind of irony in how they were viewed. Of course, many of those attacks took place in France. It remains today the largest Jewish community in Europe. And when you spoke to French leaders as to what they saw and how they would address them, you really had two different explanations being offered. On the one hand, there was a tendency to say, well, these attacks are coming from largely unemployed, angry, idle young people. The fact is, most of them came from Muslim and Arab backgrounds, but they would downplay that and say, well, these are just attacks that in many cases are indiscriminate. They're not only focused on Jewish targets, other buildings as well have been targeted by these groups. Police had trouble with them, but they were dismissing the particular Jewish element in the targets that Jews themselves could easily recognize. Or a different argument was presented. That, in fact, acknowledged the Muslim or Arab background of these attackers. It acknowledged as well their focus on Jewish targets. But instead, they went on to say, but you know, these were really motivated by political anger. They didn't like what was taking place in the Middle East. French political leaders were not necessarily shy in their own criticism of the Israeli government. And so by identifying them as somehow political, they were saying that they really weren't anti-Semitic. This really wasn't a problem of anti-Semitism. Well, this was an untenable position, as we've come to see, for any government to hold. And in any case, literally, Jews, Jewish kids in school buses on the way to school, Jews walking in the streets, synagogues, Jewish community buildings, had suddenly now become the subject of the target of attacks. Something, again, that even a year earlier or 2 years earlier, one would not see and one would not have imagined. And ultimately, that led to a significant mobilization to address it. But of course, first to be able to define it and to give it the proper attention it deserved. In this case, I think what we saw was significant political pressure that came from the United States. As European leaders visited the US, they would hear from members of Congress and others, and this would now become one matter of their concern. I think we need to recognize as well that many governments in Europe at the time did not even have a process in place that acknowledged or recognized or in any systematic way enumerated what we now recognize or call hate crimes, incidents that are attacks on individuals or buildings with a biased motivation. So they certainly were not recording such attacks and going further to disaggregate the cause of them as being anti-Semitic. So in a way, even though these attacks took place and Jews themselves and Jewish communities recognized them, many governments had no vehicle to formally record or acknowledge them. It was only, I think, as more attacks took place that ultimately governments couldn't avoid addressing them. As I said, in many cases, U.S. Members of Congress, political leaders, diplomats raised the issue. I can recall in particular, in 2002, a delegation of American senators, led at the time by the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Joe Biden, visiting Paris and meeting with President Chirac. He met before, this delegation, before meeting with the president, met with a group of French Jewish leaders. So they had a firsthand picture from that French Jewish community of what was taking place, which they could then take in their own conversation with the French president. A kind of irony, if you will, that the French Jewish community had a very important and significant messenger to address its problem with the French president, namely Senator Biden and his colleagues. The US also was active, but other countries joined as well, in looking to the OSCE as a vehicle to take up the issue of anti-Semitism. This was, of course, and you in Vienna know it very well, essentially a security apparatus that had its origins in the height of the Cold War, a way to bring together the Soviet Union, Western Europe, and North America to address human rights questions and security questions. But in its post-communist structure, it broadened its reach, and it seemed to be an interesting and appropriate venue to take up the issue of anti-Semitism. And notably, it was an opportunity where the United States sat directly around the table with European governments. It could, in this case, the United States could be a force in taking this up in a way that would not be possible in other multi-governmental organizations, such as the Council of Europe or the European Union, in which the US was not a direct participant. But the OSCE itself is a strange operation, something that I've learned well over the years, and Regina is learning too. It makes decisions by consensus. That means no decision is ever simple or easy. But the effort at the time was to say, let's organize in Vienna, under the auspices of the OSCE, a conference that will now address the problem we were seeing of anti-Semitism in Europe. And ultimately, that conference took place in 2003 in Vienna. We had a very active US ambassador, diplomat, leading the efforts, but he worked closely with his German colleague and others. And the OSCE agreed to host such a conference. I am sure at the time, and I know having been a participant in discussing informally with ambassadors from various OSCE countries, which together made the decision to support this conference, that for many of them, they may have imagined this would be one conference, one time. You would deal with the issue and then you move on to something else. It was attended in a significant way. It varied in terms of levels of delegations, but the US was interested in highlighting its importance. And in fact, it's a somewhat, almost I think perhaps trivia answer today, but the US delegation at the time was led by someone who was widely heralded then as America's mayor, Rudy Giuliani, who well before all of his current manifestations was highly admired for his leadership at 9/11. And interestingly, in his work in New York at this conference, Rudy Giuliani could speak about US efforts, or in his case, New York efforts, New York City efforts in identifying and responding to hate crimes. It was a first conference. But before the gavel marked its end, the German delegates stood up and said they wanted to play host to a follow-up conference the following year in Berlin. And so what for many might have been a one-time event now became something that had future life. Of course, the problem of anti-Semitism was not solved. It hardly was diminished by this conference, but it gave significant attention. And focus then turned to this Berlin conference, which took place in April of 2004. In this case, this conference was attended by many of the respective participating states' foreign ministers. The US Secretary of State Colin Powell was there. It included, and Regina made reference to this in introducing me, the issuance of what has been termed the Berlin Declaration. And of course, as I mentioned, when the OSCE acts by consensus, this meant that this would be a declaration that had the endorsement, or at least did not have the opposition of any of, at the time, the 55 countries that constituted the OSCE. And that declaration was notable for a couple of reasons. It spoke of anti-Semitism taking on new forms and manifestations. And this was at least an implicit reference to the kind of anti-Semitism that we had seen taking place already for a couple of years. In other words, anti-Semitism relating to Israel. In regard to this, that meant Jews being attacked in a way as surrogate targets for the state of Israel, but also where Israel itself was demonized, where its very legitimacy was called into question. The very sort of thing that we had seen taking place at that UN conference in Durban. It notably also said that events in Israel and in the Middle East can never justify anti-Semitism. Now, I don't want to say the political leaders were ultimately saying that those incidents, those attacks were justified, but they were in some ways, as I noted earlier, excusing them because of the politics of the Middle East. So those were very important, clear statements that were part of this declaration, which then went on to enumerate various commitments that the participating states agreed to take to deal with anti-Semitism. They agreed to collect data on hate crimes. They also expressed a commitment to Holocaust education and remembrance, viewed, of course, as a way to help address the problem of anti-Semitism. And this led as well to the creation of a new department at the OSCE, at its Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, ODIHR, focused exclusively on the problems of promoting or dealing with tolerance and non-discrimination, essentially to address all the areas that are part of my mandate, Regina's mandate, and our colleagues at the OSCE, and to implement many of these programs or these commitments that were spelled out in this declaration. Now, 2004 was also a turning point, not only because of this Berlin conference, but also what took place at the European Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia, known as the EUMC. This was a small center, and while its focus was broad, it had never actually conducted a survey, a research, or analysis on the problem of anti-Semitism in Europe. But in 2004, it conducted its own research, and it produced a report that really came in two forms, or in two parts. It relied on its monitors in EU countries to collect information, opinion survey polls, other information that was published, if there were collection of hate crime, anti-Semitic incidents, to review them, and to try to provide a picture, country by country, of the problem of anti-Semitism. And it also, its director and her colleagues conducted personal interviews with Jewish leaders in various EU member states to gauge their own feelings, their own reactions, their own sense of what was taking place. And we saw in those two reports almost a disconnect. Again, available data itself was limited, so what these monitors could report was also somewhat limited. It did not necessarily look like a dire problem, depending on what they had available. But almost uniformly, these interviews with Jewish leaders offered a picture that one really had not imagined, I think, until only a year or two earlier. Namely, many of them, Holocaust survivors who rebuilt their lives in these European countries, were saying they had not really experienced the sense of anxiety and uncertainty they were then for almost all those years since the Holocaust and the war had ended. So a level of fear, a level of anxiety, a level of uncertainty that truly was dramatic. Some people maybe tried to dismiss this as perhaps Jewish paranoia or overreaction. And yet I think many others recognize, and looking at the histories the people lived through.
So the floor is yours.
So in 2004, we developed with the UMC a comprehensive definition, working first with Jewish experts on anti-Semitism, but with the idea that we would be able to enumerate in somewhat succinct fashion different examples that illustrate the complex nature of anti-Semitism, stereotypes of Jews, Holocaust denial, but also, of course, anti-Semitism as it related to Israel. This became known as the working definition of anti-Semitism. It was issued by the EUMC in March of 2005. This really was the first effort to develop such a definition that would have practical application and use. The goal was something that could be readily understood by monitors, by police, and others who had a challenge, had the responsibility of addressing anti-Semitism. Now, we could see, and really what emerged, I think, with some clarity, was essentially anti-Semitism presenting itself largely from three sources. There was anti-Semitism from the right, a form of anti-Semitism, long-standing, long recognized and understood, perhaps in the part of ultranationalist political parties, neo-Nazi groups and the like. But we were seeing anti-Semitism on the left. And this anti-Semitism frequently was a form of anti-Israel or anti-Zionism that had literally crossed over. And we were seeing anti-Semitism certainly in the form of incidents and attacks on Jewish targets coming from parts of the Muslim populations in Europe. In some ways, we would identify and make a distinction where some of this anti-Semitism referenced extremist Islamist views and might develop into physical lethal attacks on Jewish targets. But physical verbal harassment that many Jews in various European cities experienced, a lesser but no less troubling form of anti-Semitism, came from a broader cross-section of Muslim and Arabs in Europe, a group that was, I think, a source of the problem that was also difficult for governments to fully accept. In some cases, such as France, governments did not, and by law, would not distinguish based on religion groups and what was taking place by them or to them. And in some other countries, I think it was a matter of political correctness or expediency, not wanting to dwell on this segment of society and bring it forward. But that raised yet another problem for Jews in Europe. If they did not believe that their governments recognized the problems they faced, how could they have much confidence that those governments would be in a position to really help address and deal with the problem? And so we began to see a first and critical issue, simply the basic security of Jewish communities in Europe. The fact is that governments did ultimately come forward. The OSCE was an important venue to get to the issue of what government should do when it comes to security. But probably the main driving force was literally the physical attacks, lethal attacks that were taking place on Jewish communities. We saw the tragedy of the attack on the Jewish school in Toulouse, France in 2012, attack at the Jewish Museum in Brussels in 2014, attack on the synagogue, a death of a volunteer security guard in Copenhagen in 2015. I want to say, and as I had the opportunity in my OSCE role to visit a number of these countries and meet with government officials, it was a struggle to get governments to recognize they had a problem and to come forward and deal with this. In some cases, even governments were willing to acknowledge it, but did not see that they had some special obligation to help support Jewish communities to deal with the security problem. In some cases, communities were spending significant proportion of their own budget just to provide for their own physical security. Some countries said, well, if we provide for one community, we have to provide for another or another. That was not a way of saying we're going to do something full and comprehensive. And of course, the security concerns were different for Jews than maybe for other communities, but often an excuse not to do something. But again, I think with concerted efforts, we have seen significant achievement in addressing security. Of course, in saying this, I think we recognize the sadness of what it reveals, the need to provide physical security guards in front of synagogues and in front of schools. But that has sadly become a reality today. Now, what we have seen as well is security as a focus, but not really defining the nature of the problem throughout Europe, which varies country by country, but also is quite different if we look at Central and Eastern Europe and what have been its sources of anti-Semitism or the anxiety that its Jewish communities have expressed. We do have the basis for a more objective, data-driven analysis of how communities view their problem in the surveys that were undertaken by the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights, or FRA. These surveys give us a more complete picture of how Jews themselves have experienced anti-Semitism and what it has meant in their lives. Obviously, in various countries, it has limited what Jews will do in public, and that is an alarming but important finding for us to see, and that had significant help in pushing governments to act. But we see a different picture when we look at some of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe. You did not have this immigrant Muslim population, not necessarily the kind of attacks that we were seeing in Western Europe, but we were seeing something else. And this really goes to the challenge of confronting Holocaust history. In fact, most of these countries did not confront that history. Certainly, there was no opportunity to do so until the fall of communism in 1991. But as we saw, as you know all too well in Austria, even countries that had no constraint to deal with this history, it did not come easily, it did not come quickly. Again, in Austria, it was only in 1995 that this was fully addressed or acknowledged. The same was true in France. So in looking at these countries in the Baltic states that became part of the Soviet Union even before the war ended, or in Eastern European countries, there was never a confrontation with the role of their own citizens or perhaps even puppet governments at the time in the Holocaust. In fact, in most of these cases, countries' citizens saw themselves, with some correctness, as being victims of communism for half a century. But this became an opportunity or a need to really get these countries to look at that Holocaust era history. Here, there was the opportunity because of the effort of these countries to join NATO to push this issue. We could do it from Washington, where NATO enlargement really was being managed. And what we saw was a kind of effort to jumpstart looking at this history. The creation of international historical commissions in these countries became a vehicle to deal with the problem. The fact was that as these countries in the 1990s began to try and redefine their own sense of identity and nationalism, many looked back to the fascist era and saw in fascist era leaders figures to be admired, to be revived, to serve perhaps as a basis for this new nationalism. well, you can understand and imagine what this meant for Jews in these countries, who themselves were, in many cases, almost exclusively were Holocaust survivors or their descendants. To actually pay honor, erect statues, name streets after them, the very people who were complicit in the murder of Jews. And so what we saw was an ongoing effort to deal with that history. It mattered, of course, for the history itself, but it also mattered for a sense of security and rootedness of the Jewish communities in those very same countries. That process led to efforts to commemorate the Holocaust, efforts to develop educational materials to deal with that part of history. But these countries were pushed to do it. And the fact that NATO membership was a kind of prize for them, and this was part of the process. This was part of what they had to do to gain that membership. I was involved in a number of the creation and involvement of these historical commissions, more from the political side of the way things evolved. And we did see a significant success, but I think there was always a sense that governments and leaders, even if they knew what the right thing was, were doing it with some ambivalence, with a sense that the population itself might not fully embrace it. Paralleling these efforts to deal with history were efforts to negotiate the return of Jewish communal property and private property, all of which had measures of success, but anti-Semitism accompanying it as well. Now, over time, much has been addressed in this fashion, but now we're seeing a kind of return or revival of some of this. In some cases, it's used as a basis to support right-wing political movements and parties. And we can no longer say it's a matter of ignorance, as we could perhaps 30 years ago. Today, I think in some countries, they know better, but do it all the same. We saw in Hungary essentially significant progress, the development of a Holocaust museum going back now 20 years. But then we saw later efforts to create a new museum with an alternative narrative on the history of the Holocaust in Hungary, one that would greatly underplay the role of Hungarians themselves and place mostly full blame on Germany. This is one example, there are others, but we see how challenging and how difficult that has been. I would turn now to another problem, which is not perhaps clearly or at the obvious sense a problem of anti-Semitism, but in a way it is still, if not anti-Semitism by intent, anti-Semitism in effect. And I speak now of something that's going on largely in Northern Europe in various countries, but efforts to ban religious slaughter and ritual circumcision, practices that are elemental to Jewish life, and that really for centuries never faced any kind of government control or restriction. But now in the name of animal rights activists or advocates for child protection, you have movements that are calling for the banning of circumcision, at least circumcision of minors. Brit Milah is what we say in Hebrew, a practice that Jews have carried out since biblical times. And efforts to actually ban this would effectively mean Jewish communities would no longer have the basis to continue in these countries. We saw only early this month a vote to do so in Denmark. We're likely to see one emerge in Finland later this year. So far, laws have not been passed to do this, but as one will find from Jewish communities and others. This is not a practice that's widely understood. And so efforts to ban these practices, they fear, have popular support and could ultimately pass. We have seen various countries already effectively ban kosher and halal slaughter. Jewish communities may function by saying we can import kosher meat, but as more countries do this, that too leads to a very, very real question as to the future viability of Jewish life. And in the process of these campaigns, even if they themselves and those advocates for them are not anti-Semitic, it does bring out anti-Semitism in the dialogue and the rhetoric that accompanies them, and certainly anti-Muslim rhetoric and expressions as well. So I would say those are the issues we confront today, that anti-Semitism from the right, from the left. I should note when I speak of anti-Semitism from the left, perhaps the best example is what we saw in the British Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. Effectively, the party itself was investigated for anti-Semitism by the government equity body, and certainly the experience of individual Jews in the Labour Party gave voice to this. Very much the sense that there was an anti-Zionist undergirding that really crossed over into anti-Semitism on the part of the political leadership of the Labour Party at the time. It's an example of it. It's hardly the only one that we face. And so in the brief time remaining, I'd like to say a few words about what's going on in the United States, what we've seen also with regard to this working definition of anti-Semitism. As some of you know, that definition first developed by the UMC, which ultimately closed its doors, later became the IRA working definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition adopted by IRA in May of 2016, and now formally adopted by nearly 30 countries in use, recommended public and privately, really around the world. Strong expressions of support for it by the UN Secretary General, by the Secretary General of the OAS, and one that I think even as it's finding more and more adherence and now fully promoted by the European Union itself, there are variants that have emerged and critics of that definition. I don't think time remains to go into detail. If there's opportunity for questions, I will. But I think some of the critics of this have focused on concerns that the definition will have a chilling effect on speech or maybe misused to label critics of Israel as anti-Semite, which the definition itself is careful not to do. It clearly states criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitism. It really, in offering examples, stresses they may be examples of anti-Semitism, depending on the context. But what we've seen now in these last days, frankly, has been a resurgence of anti-Semitic attacks and incidents. It is not surprising. We saw when there were flare-ups in the Middle East, going back, for example, 2014, the war then in Gaza brought forward attacks on Jewish targets throughout Europe. So this has taken place also in these last days. But I have to say, we are surprised here in the United States that we've seen the very same thing, because we had not seen that before. And I think here in the US, our challenge has become even addressing anti-Semitism, like so much else in the American political arena today. The problem has become a partisan one and a battle across political lines. That working definition of anti-Semitism, which was promoted in bipartisan legislation, but ultimately not not passed by Congress several years ago, was issued as an executive order by President Trump in December of 2019. And I'm afraid in doing so, as an executive order, it's valuable, but as an executive order of President Trump, it only further politicized the problem itself and perhaps did not help in that regard. I think we saw as well racist, xenophobic, physical attacks increasing here in the United States, notably the insurrection that took place in January. And anti-Semitism and anti-Semites were very much part of what was happening. And so we've seen now in these last weeks, they're receding as a ceasefire is taking hold in Israel and Gaza, but we've seen attacks on Jewish targets and essentially Jewish communities in America mobilizing now with a focus on dealing with anti-Semitism here, much as I think we have in earlier years focused on dealing with anti-Semitism there in Europe and elsewhere. I believe we will be able to address it, we will be able to challenge it, and we'll be able to overcome it. But it really remains a significant problem. Again, a problem dealing with security, a problem with education, a problem also with anti-Semitism, linked with events in the Middle East and with the challenges and problems of anti-Semitism as that working definition itself has laid out. Understanding the time frame, let me stop here. I don't know if there's time for questions, but in any case, apart from the interruption that technology brought us, I'm pleased that it did allow me to at least be with all of you virtually today in Vienna.
We are applauding. Thank you very much, dear Rabbi Baker, for introducing us into the international horizon of this issue, showing us the role of international institutions, of states and governments, the different types of anti-Semitism, the IRA definition. I think there will be some questions, commentaries, contradictions whatsoever. I open the floor to the audience. We have 5 to 7 minutes time. Anybody who wants to say it? Then, it's a problem? Okay, alles okay. Dr. Svoboda.
Thank you very much. Maybe just one question. We see anti-Semitism very much spread around via the social media. You didn't, as far as I understood, didn't touch it. So is your work for the OECD also affecting or concerning the social media effects? And because I think that would be very important also to go deeper into that issue. Thank you.
Certainly, I think social media is everyone's focus today when it comes to the spread of anti-Semitism, of other forms of ethnic hatred, racism, and the like. Many of us have engaged directly with some of the social media companies in terms of how they address the problem and in terms of what they will do in the case of Europe under threat of fine and legal pressure to remove anti-Semitic postings from their sites. But this is, I think this is a battle that in many ways we all recognize we're losing, namely that this kind of hatred can spread very rapidly, even if it is incumbent on these companies to remove it within 24 hours. Literally millions of people can see this content even in that brief period. And I think we see how it, even as social media, there's so much that's positive in allowing us to link together with people that hold views like ours, join in common projects and activities that obviously can link up people who share the common hatred and motivations, and even provide support for moving from the virtual to the physical world when it comes to attacks. So I think it's essentially the platform or the public square of the 21st century. And if anything, over this last year of COVID, so much of this has focused, just as so much of our lives have focused, living online, on the role of social media in dealing with this. The various forms of anti-Semitism that I described, the various issues that we're addressing, all present themselves on social media as well. So in a way, it is both the platform as well as the problem that we see today.
Thank you very much, Andy. I would have two questions. The OSCE also has a special focus on the participation of civil society. Maybe you could elaborate a little more about this. What could be the contributions of civil society? In particular, we have students among us, young people within the room, on the screens. What could be their part? This would be my first question. And the second question concerns to your personal experience in the last 10 years. It took a long time to promote this issue. Maybe you could share with us ideas, experiences that have positive effects and such that have less positive effects in communication, in dialogue, in programs, in initiatives, and so on and so forth.
Sure, Regina. Well, the hallmark of the OSCE is that civil society sits around the same table as participating states, as governments. I mentioned the Durban UN conference. The UN formula is essentially civil society may attend and organize parallel events to those of governments. But in the OSCE, for example, each fall in the Human Dimension implementation meeting, literally around the same table are all of the representatives of participating states, but virtually any NGO, legitimate NGO, can attend as well and take the floor and speak. And I think particularly in the area in which I'm focused, of the OSCE addressing anti-Semitism, so much of what it now does in a formal way, it does only because civil society groups push the OSCE to do so. And I think that really is, it begins with civil society, it begins with activists. But the goal of the OSCE, as I see it, is to get governments to act, to get governments to take responsibility and to respond. And if I look at this trajectory, again, going back whether to the first conference in Vienna or in Berlin over 15 years ago, we can see various instruments that are now formally part of the OSCE that were spawned by those groups pushing it to do so. I think people ought to keep this in mind. That's really how we get governments to act. Even if they recognize a problem, they don't necessarily move unless pushed. Now, again, I do think there are many sort of positive things we've seen that have come out of this. I think one aspect is simply to bring forward the nature of the problem in a way that people may not have understood or seen it before. The personal stories of people who've been victimized, the actual reality on the ground of what communities have to deal with. Once confronted with this, it makes it more and more difficult for governments or political leaders to avert their eyes or to say we have other issues we want to address. I had been in my own role in Copenhagen the fall before that attack on the synagogue. And at the time, meeting with the Jewish community, they shared with me their physical fears, and yet the government was not responding. And when I met with the government at the time, they said to me, you know, we have a very relaxed approach to security in Denmark. Look at the parliament. You don't find armed guards in front of the parliament. And so it wasn't that they were ignoring the Jewish community's concerns, but they were saying they were upset or they were also calculating that the general population would be upset if they saw armed guards in front of the synagogue on the street in Copenhagen. And so they would deal with it in a different way, which is to say, not provide that kind of permanent security. Several months later, you had an attack. There were no police present. And the government was genuinely grieving for what had happened, recognizing that it should have done something and it did not. And it was a very sad experience. I managed to be in Copenhagen for the memorial service for that security guard who had been killed. Again, without his heroism and the physical security that the community itself had installed, it could have been a terrible, terrible attack. But the government ultimately responded. And now, some years later, we have perhaps one of the best examples of Jewish community security fully integrated with police, with government authorities in Denmark. So we literally have a community promoting what is referred to now as the Danish model for Jewish community security. And yet there was a problem that was so grievous only 6 years earlier. So that would be at least one example, Regina, of where we've seen something difficult, but we've seen something positive emerge. One other example, which I think also gets directly to much of your own work, we've seen, for example, in Malmö, Sweden, significant attacks over the years on Jewish targets in that country. It's an immigrant city, so there's significant numbers of people from Arab countries in North Africa and the Middle East, Muslim background, and a Jewish community that was literally emigrating because of the problem. With government support, but with some creative thinking on the part of the Jewish community and others outside, a new rabbi was brought to Malmö with the essential mandate to work in partnership with a Muslim religious leader, with an imam, to try and promote Jewish-Muslim understanding. They literally take their own dialogue to schools throughout the city. It's a very impressive undertaking. It's a symbolic one, but it's a real one as well. I don't think they are under any illusion that the two of them can truly change the attitudes of an entire community. But the fact that they are doing this, that they have public recognition for it, sends a message that at least is counter to the one that has promoted intolerance and led to attacks on the Jewish community. So here too, it's an effort that had government support, but also one that really truly involves in its day-to-day work, civil society itself, the communities themselves.